He thought he was just filming trees, rivers, and sunlight until his camera captured something no one could explain. What began as a peaceful nature project quickly turned into a journey that unraveled secrets buried deep in the forest. And in himself. If you stay with me to the end, I promise this story will leave you thinking about what's hidden in the quiet places we forget to look. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Type your city or country in the comments below, and let's see how far this story reaches. Now, let's get started. After 40 years of teaching high school biology, Daniel Whitmore had finally settled into the kind of quiet retirement most people only dream about. Tucked away in a modest cedar cabin at the edge of the Willamette National Forest in Oregon, he spent his days surrounded by pine trees, deer trails, and birdsong. The loss of his wife, Lillian, 2 years prior, had left a hollow ache in his chest, one that city life only seemed to amplify. So he'd sold their home in Salem, packed up a lifetime of books, old cameras, and memories, and moved to the woods where the air was cleaner and the silence had weight. Out here, time moved differently. There were no traffic lights or shopping lists, just the rhythm of nature and the comfort of being alone, but not entirely lonely. Daniel had always been fond of nature photography, but it was only in retirement that he took up videography with any seriousness. Every morning, rain or shine, he would carry his tripod and digital camera down the narrow trail behind his cabin, looking for something new to capture. A woodpecker drumming on a hollow tree, a fox slinking through underbrush, a time-lapse of clouds rolling across the mountain ridge. He wasn't chasing internet fame or views. He just liked preserving little moments. It made him feel useful. It gave his days purpose. His adult children, Emily and Josh, often teased him about it during Sunday calls, calling him Grandpa National Geographic. Daniel didn't mind. In fact, he liked it. That Wednesday afternoon was no different. The sun hung low, golden, light slanting through the tall firs as Daniel set up his camera at his favorite spot, a clearing where the deer often grazed in the late hours. He adjusted the lens, made sure the angle was right, and stepped back to let the camera roll on. It zoned for a while. It was peaceful. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and for a moment, everything felt still and safe. After 20 minutes, he packed up and headed home, looking forward to editing the footage with a hot cup of tea by the fireplace. Later that evening, as the wind whistled gently outside and the kettle steamed in the background, Daniel settled into his recliner and transferred the footage to his laptop. He watched it unfold in real time. Just trees swaying, a squirrel hopping across the frame, a bird landing on a distant branch. Then something strange happened. Around the 12-minute mark, a flicker caught his eye. A shadow, perhaps. He paused the video, moved the cursor back a few seconds, and played it again. There it was, clear as day. For no more than 2 or 3 seconds, a figure appeared between 2 tall trees at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move. It didn't step forward or wave. It just stood there, tall, motionless, like it was watching. Daniel stared at the screen, heart suddenly thudding, harder than it had in years. He leaned in, squinting. The figure wasn't detailed. It was partially obscured by distance and leaves, but it didn't look like a hiker. The shape was too narrow, too straight. There was something off about its proportions, as if it didn't quite belong. He froze the frame and snapped a screenshot. Then he played the next few seconds. The figure was gone. No rustling, no blur of motion. Just vanished. Daniel rubbed his temples. He hadn't seen anyone out there. He was sure of it. That trail behind his cabin wasn't popular. In fact, he hadn't seen another soul out there in weeks. He considered the possibilities. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a bear standing upright, or even just a weird artifact in the footage. But the figure had shape, presence, and above all, It had eyes. Or what he thought were eyes, dark, unblinking spots that seemed locked on the camera lens, like it knew it was being filmed, trying to shake off the unease. Daniel called Emily. She picked up with her usual cheery voice. "Hey, Dad, you getting eaten by bears yet?" He chuckled, but it came out thinner than he meant. "No bears. But I saw something on my camera today. Don't know what to make of it." He sent her the frame. A few seconds later, she replied, with a laugh, "It's probably glare or a branch or something. You've got that spooky forest imagination again." Daniel nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Yeah, probably. But deep down, it didn't feel like nothing. He'd spent hundreds of hours watching that forest, capturing every inch of it through every season. He knew how shadows behaved, how animals moved, how the wind played tricks on light. This wasn't like anything he'd seen before. And yet, when he opened his front door to take out the trash later that night, the air felt normal. Cold, but normal. The forest stood silent under the stars, wrapped in stillness. No sound, no movement. Just before bed, he couldn't help but play the clip one more time. He paused it on the frame with the figure, studying the way it stood so deliberate, so perfectly still. Then, as if to prove something to himself, he got up and checked that all the doors were locked. As he lay down, the trees outside his bedroom window swayed gently in the wind, their shadows long and silent across the floor. He closed his eyes, but in the back of his mind, a single question lingered like a whisper. What if it had been watching him, not just in the video, but long before he ever noticed? The next morning came with a light frost on the windows and a sky the color of old tin. Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the towering firs that surrounded his cabin. The forest had always brought him comfort, but now something gnawed at that peace. The image from the night before stayed with him, not just the shadowy figure, but the way it had felt so still, so intentional, like it had meant to be seen, like it wanted to be noticed. He told himself he was being ridiculous, letting his imagination run wild after a lifetime of ghost stories and too much solitude. Still, he packed up his camera that afternoon and went back. The trail was damp and quiet, muffled by fallen pine needles. Squirrels darted up trees, birds flitted overhead, but the deeper he walked into the woods, the more the forest seemed to draw in on itself. Daniel arrived at the clearing where he had filmed the footage. The sun filtered through the branches in slanted rays. Everything looked normal, familiar, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He moved slowly, scanning the trees, the ground, the edges of the clearing. No footprints, no disturbed soil, just nature, untouched. But that only made it more unsettling. He remembered exactly where the figure had appeared. He stood in the same spot, raised his camera, and tried to recreate the shot. Nothing. Just a motionless forest and the steady sound of his own breathing. He lingered for nearly an hour, half expecting, half dreading that the figure might appear again. But nothing moved. It was as if the woods were waiting. He returned to his cabin as the light began to fade, and by the time he reached his porch, long shadows stretched across the yard. He locked the door behind him and sat down to review the new footage. Just like before, trees, light, birds, silence. No strange shapes, no flickers, no watchers. Still, he couldn't let it go. He stared at the old frame again, enlarging it, adjusting the contrast, trying to pull something more from it. It wasn't a person. That much was becoming clear. The limbs were too long, the posture too straight. It had no face, at least, not one the camera could see. That night, after the fire had burned down and the wind started tapping the window panes, Daniel was jolted awake by a deep, soft thud. It was followed by another, and then another. Like footsteps, but slower. He sat up in bed, his heart already racing. He listened closely. The sound had stopped. He pulled on his robe and walked to the door, cracked it open, and peered outside. The yard was empty. The sky was full of stars, and the trees were still. He stepped outside onto the porch, the cold biting at his ankles, and stood there for a long moment. Nothing moved. There was no sound. No wind. Only a thick, unnatural silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He went back inside, double-checked the locks, and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind replayed the footage again and again. He couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. That something had seen him the same way he had seen it. He told himself he was tired, that his eyes were playing tricks, that the noise had been the wind or a tree branch. But none of those explanations fit the weight he felt in his chest. The next day, he called Emily again. He tried to keep his voice calm, light, as he told her about the strange noises and the figure in the footage. But she could hear it in his tone, something between fascination and fear. "Dad," she said gently, "maybe you should take a break from the forest for a while. Come visit us in Portland. Josh is coming up this weekend with the kids." Daniel gave a small laugh. I'm not losing it, I think I saw something that doesn't make sense." She paused. "Even if you did, you don't need to stay out there by yourself." He promised he'd think about it, but as he hung up the phone, he already knew he wouldn't be leaving. Not yet. Not until he understood what he'd seen. That evening, he set up his motion-activated trail cameras around the perimeter of his cabin, one facing the path to the woods. One pointed toward the clearing, another near the back, aimed at the dense thicket where the trees pressed close. He checked the batteries twice, made sure the memory cards were in place, and tested the motion sensors. Everything worked perfectly. That night, he went to bed with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation curling in his stomach. He kept the curtains slightly open, letting the moonlight cast long stripes across the floor. Around 2 a.m., something woke him. A flicker of light, a feeling. He lay still, listening. Then the sound came again, low, slow, deliberate. Thud, thud, then silence. He didn't get up, didn't open the door this time. He just waited. The next morning, with trembling fingers, he gathered the trail cameras and plugged them into his laptop one by one. Most of the footage was normal branches swaying, a passing raccoon, a squirrel at dawn. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., every single feed glitched. The image cut to static, then black. And then, in each video, just before the picture returned, a single frame appeared. A shape tall, narrow, standing at the very edge of the frame. Not moving, not walking, just watching. No face, no features. And yet it radiated presence. Daniel sat back, chilled to the bone. It wasn't just one camera. It was all of them. Simultaneous disruption. One shape. Same posture. Same hour. Same stillness. He didn't know what it was. But whatever it was, it had come closer. And it knew exactly where he lived. Daniel didn't sleep that night. After watching the glitch-ridden footage from all 3 cameras and freezing on the eerie figure that had appeared so briefly, he sat in his chair by the fireplace with the lights dimmed low, heart thudding like it hadn't in years. He replayed the clips over and over again, trying to catch some small clue in the grainy frames, some detail, some slip that might prove this was just a technical failure or some trick of the forest. But there was none. The disruption in the feed happened at the exact same second on all cameras, and the shape that appeared was too similar, too symmetrical to be a fluke. It didn't move. It didn't walk. It didn't flee. It just appeared, watched, and vanished. As though the act of being recorded had made it real. As the clock ticked past 3, he stood up slowly, and moved to the door, half expecting something to be waiting for him on the other side. But the porch was empty. A thin mist hung over the yard, clinging to the ground like a whisper. He stepped out cautiously, his breath clouding in the air, eyes darting from tree to tree. The woods stood still, silent, almost as though they were holding their breath. He felt a strange pressure in his ears, like the world had been padded with cotton, a hush too complete to be natural. He turned back inside and locked the door behind him, unsure if it was to keep something out or to keep himself in. Over the yesterday. Next few nights, the noises returned, always faint, always at the edge of hearing. A low thud, like a heavy footfall. A faint crack of a branch underweight. Sometimes it was rhythmic, like something pacing just beyond the light of his porch. Other times it came all at once, like a flurry of motion stopped just short of his cabin. Daniel tried not to jump at every creak in the floor or gust of wind against the window, but the tension in his body was constant, like a wire pulled too tight. He couldn't explain what he was feeling, but he knew, in the marrow of his bones, that he was no longer alone in those woods. On the fourth night, he stayed up again, waiting. Midnight passed in silence. 1 o'clock. Then 2. And then, as if summoned by the ticking of the clock, the motion camera light blinked on. Daniel rushed to his laptop, eyes scanning the feed. Static again, then black. Then, for a split second there, it was the shape. Standing just feet from the camera this time, right at the edge of the cabin's property line. It hadn't moved closer in the video, but Daniel could feel the difference. It was watching not from a distance, but from the threshold. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. He needed answers, or at least some sense that he hadn't gone completely mad. At the ranger station, he found an older man behind the desk ranger. Cliff McAllister, a wiry man in his 70s with a sun-weathered face and calm blue eyes. Daniel hesitated at first, unsure of how much to share without sounding unhinged. But as he described the figure, the glitches, and the strange noises, he saw the look on Cliff's face change. Not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition. Cliff waited until the room was empty, then leaned in over the desk. "Where exactly did you say you filmed that footage?" "About a mile behind my cabin, east of Bear Creek Trail," Daniel replied. Cliff nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "There's been stories, for decades, really. Folks seeing shapes in the trees. Tall things, too tall. Sometimes quiet, sometimes not. Always vanish before you get close. We had a hiker go missing back there in '91. Left his gear in perfect condition. No sign of struggle. Just gone." Daniel blinked. "Were they ever found?" "Not him," Cliff said, then added with a pause. "But others. They came back different. Changed. One fella in '83, Carl Jensen, came stumbling out of the woods after being gone a week. Wouldn't talk. Stared at trees like they were speaking to him. Ended up in a hospital downstate. Never said another word." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "And no one's done anything?" Cliff gave a dry laugh. "About what? Shapes in the woods?" "The forest is big. Too big. Hard to make a case out of blurry footage and tall tales. Officially, we call it optical illusion. Unofficially." He trailed off, then looked Daniel dead in the eye. "Some parts of the forest don't like to be watched." That sentence stuck with Daniel all the way home. It echoed in his mind, even as he tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just the stress. Maybe Cliff was just humoring an old man with too much time on his hands. But no part of Daniel truly believed that anymore. That night, he brought the cameras inside. He lit the fire. He made his tea. And then he sat in the dark, not watching the screen this time, but listening. At precisely 2:17 a.m., he heard it again. A thud, then another. Then silence so thick it hummed in his ears. He didn't get up, He didn't move. He just sat there, heart pounding, as the cabin seemed to hold its breath. And then, just beneath the crackle of the fire, he thought he heard something else. Whispers. Faint, indistinct. As if the forest itself had leaned in to speak. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after his coffee had gone cold, staring blankly out the window. The trees swayed gently under the gray Oregon sky, but their motion no longer brought him peace. It felt choreographed somehow, like part of a performance he hadn't realized he was watching. He hadn't slept. The whispers he thought he'd heard beneath the fire's crackle had stopped the moment he leaned forward to listen, as if they knew, as if they only wanted to be heard when they couldn't be understood. The forest used to feel familiar, even sacred. Now it felt aware. He didn't know why, but he found himself driving back to the ranger station just before noon. The memory of Cliff's face when he spoke of the vanished hiker still fresh in his mind. Daniel needed to know more than just vague stories and half-whispered folklore. Cliff was alone when Daniel arrived, polishing a rusted thermos and listening to an old country station playing quietly in the corner. When Daniel walked in, the ranger looked up, and his expression turned serious before Daniel even opened his mouth. "You came back," Cliff said, setting the thermos down. Daniel nodded, took a seat across from him. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about some parts of the forest not wanting to be watched." Cliff didn't answer right away. He rubbed a calloused thumb along the brim of his hat, then leaned back with a tired sigh. "Most folks come out here and see trees, deer, maybe a bear or two if they're lucky. But every few years, someone like you shows up. Someone who doesn't just look but sees. And once you see it, it sees you back." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "What is it, Cliff? What did I see?" Cliff looked out the window, his voice lowering. "No one really knows. Old stories talk about watchers, spirits, guardians, even echoes. Some say they're ancient things tied to the land. Others say there's something else entirely, something that exists where the veil between our world and something older is thin. Doesn't matter what you call them. What matters is that they don't like attention. The more you look, the closer they come. And when they're close enough, they change things." Daniel tried to steady his voice. "You saying they're dangerous?" Cliff shrugged. "Not in the way you'd expect. They don't attack. They don't leave claw marks or broken windows. But people who get too close, they don't come back the same. Some disappear. Others come back and can't sleep without lights on, can't be near trees, can't remember their own names. One woman couldn't bear the sound of wind anymore. She said it whispered lies to her." Daniel sat in silence, the weight of Cliff's words settling heavy on his shoulders. "I've been recording them. Cameras, trail sensors. Every night they come closer. They were standing at the edge of my yard." Cliff's eyes darkened. "You need to stop." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I can't. I need to know what they are." "Why me? Why now?" Cliff leaned forward, voice firm. "That's how it begins. Curiosity, then obsession, then silence. I've seen it too many times. I've buried more people than I care to count who thought they could solve the forest." "But what if they're trying to tell us something?" Daniel asked. "What if they're not just watchers? What if there's a reason they're showing up on camera now?" Cliff hesitated, then pulled open a drawer and slid a dusty folder across the table. Inside were newspaper clippings, old black and white photographs, hand-drawn maps, and a faded photograph of a man standing at the edge of a trail. The edges of the picture were burned, and something about the man's eyes seemed wrong. "That's Elias Hart," Cliff said. "Disappeared in 1954. Was a writer. Moved into a cabin north of here to work on a book about native legends. Started seeing things, wrote about them, left notes, drawings. Then he vanished. Never found a body." But 3 months later, his journal turned up at the ranger station, left on the doorstep. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. What did it say? Cliff tapped the folder. I've read it 100 times. It's not just stories. He wrote about being followed, about hearing voices in his dreams, about figures that appeared between the trees and never blinked. He said the moment you acknowledge them, something changes. They become real in your world. And you become less real in theirs. Daniel felt the chill crawl up the back of his neck. Why show me all this? Why now? Cliff studied him for a long moment. Because I think you're already past the point of turning back. You've seen them, heard them, let them into your thoughts. That means you've already started slipping. Daniel stood slowly, unsure if his legs would carry him. The weight of everything was pressing in from all sides. What do I do now? Cliff looked at him with a sorrow Daniel hadn't expected. You can stop filming, burn the tapes, leave the forest, go back to the world that forgets. Or you can keep going and hope they let you walk far enough to understand. Outside, the sky had darkened, clouds rolling in over the peaks like a slow warning. Daniel stepped out of the ranger station with the folder under his arm and his heart heavier than it had been in years. As he drove back through the winding road toward his cabin, the trees seemed taller than before, their shadows longer, their branches less like limbs and more like arms reaching out to him. For the first time, he understood that the forest wasn't just a place. It was a presence. And it had been waiting. The forest was different now. Daniel could feel it the moment he stepped out of his truck and stood beneath the towering pines behind his cabin. There was a weight in the air, not heavy in a physical sense, but in the way certain silences can feel like they're pressing against your chest. After the visit to Ranger Cliff, Daniel hadn't slept. He'd sat up all night at the kitchen table. The journal pages and faded photographs spread before him like puzzle pieces from another life. What had struck him most wasn't the language in Elias Hart's notes, but the drawings, crude sketches of stone markers, strange tree symbols, and what looked like a path curling deep into the woods where no trails were marked. That morning, something pulled at him. Not fear, not even curiosity. Something more instinctual, like a magnet in his chest, aligning itself with something ancient and unseen. He took only his camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. No gun, no phone. He didn't even leave a note. The forest swallowed him almost immediately. He moved slower than usual, every step deliberate, listening for something he couldn't name. The trail behind his cabin was well-worn, familiar, etched into his daily routine like muscle memory. But today, he veered off just before the clearing, heading east toward the denser part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together and the light dimmed even at midday. He walked for nearly an hour without hearing another living thing. No birds, no rustling leaves, no scampering squirrels. Just the sound of his boots crunching on old pine needles and the occasional crack of a twig beneath his step. Then he saw it. Almost hidden behind a thick veil of moss and fallen branches, an old path revealed itself like something half-remembered in a dream. It wasn't carved with tools, but seemed worn down by time itself, the way deer trails thread through brush, unnoticed until you're standing right on top of them. Along either side were stones flat, upright slabs of rock that jutted from the earth like ancient teeth. Symbols had been carved into them, smoothed nearly to oblivion by age and weather. But Daniel could still trace the curves and lines with his fingertips. Some looked like twisted trees. Others resembled eyes. He took a photo, then stepped onto the path. The shift was immediate. The air grew colder, but not the kind of cold that comes from temperature. It was like walking into a different season. The wind stopped. The light dimmed as though the canopy above had thickened into something solid. He walked slowly, senses alert. After 20 minutes, He reached a small clearing where the trees seemed to arch away from the center, like they were deliberately leaning back. In the middle stood the ruins of a cabin. The walls were half collapsed, the roof missing entirely. Vines snaked up through broken floorboards. But it hadn't been touched in years. Decades, maybe. Daniel stepped inside carefully. The air smelled of mildew and dry rot. Furniture lay splintered across the floor, and a rusted stove sat in the corner, its mouth gaping like a silent scream. He moved slowly, examining the remains. There were traces of someone's life, here fragments of a ceramic cup, the metal frame of a bed, and in one corner, a rocking chair, strangely intact. It creaked gently back and forth, as though someone had just risen from it. Daniel stared at it, unsure whether the movement was real or imagined. He raised his camera to record, and the screen went black. Dead. He checked the battery. It had been fully charged. The lens refused to respond. Nothing worked. A cold shiver slid down his spine. He set the camera aside and turned toward the fireplace. Something caught his eye beneath the rubble, a warped floorboard with one end slightly lifted. He knelt, pried it up, and there, beneath layers of dirt and mouse nests, lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed and fragile. Inside, written in ink faded to sepia, was a name, Elias Hart. Daniel's heart stopped. He flipped through carefully. The entries were dated from 1953 to early 1954. At first, they were simple observations of birds, sketches of trees, reflections on solitude. But as he read deeper, the tone changed. "They come at night now," one entry read. "They know. I see them." Another said, "I hear my name in the wind. Not in my voice, but in hers. My wife's, but she's been dead 5 years." Daniel's hands trembled as he read the final entry. It was barely legible, scrawled in frantic loops. "They live in the space between. When you look too long, they step forward. I don't know what they want. I only know they remember. And now they want to be remembered in return." Daniel closed the book slowly, his fingers numb. As he stood, he heard breathing. Not his own. Deep, rhythmic. Behind him, he turned slowly, pulse roaring in his ears. Nothing. The doorway stood open, empty. The rocking chair had stopped moving. The wind had returned, only it wasn't wind. It was whispering. His name, not spoken, but breathed, as though the trees had taken voice. He stepped outside, heart pounding, and followed the path back, the journal clutched in one hand like a lifeline. The trees felt closer now, the sky above darker, as if the world itself had changed in the time he was gone. When he finally reached the familiar trail behind his cabin, he looked back. The path was gone. The stones were gone. Only trees remained, and the forest was watching. The journal sat on Daniel's desk like something alive. He hadn't opened it since returning from the ruined cabin, hadn't dared to until daylight returned in full. That night, even with every door locked and curtain drawn, the wind didn't let him rest. It scraped across the roof, moaned through the trees, whispered in 1,000 voices just outside his reach. But when morning came, nothing was out of place. No footprints. No scratches. No sign that anything unnatural had come. Close except for the feeling deep in his gut that something had followed him back. That Elias Hart hadn't just disappeared into the woods, but had left a thread behind, waiting to be pulled. Daniel made himself a pot of strong coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the journal again. The ink bled and curled at the edges, some entries smudged, others frantic. The penwork deteriorating over time, like the mind behind it, had started to unravel. But Daniel read each word carefully, with the reverence one might show sacred text. Elias had been meticulous in his early days, writing about bird migrations, moss growth, and the shape of the mountain ridges at dawn. But there was a shift subtle. At first, he began to note strange footprints near his cabin, a sense of being watched even during daylight. The entries stretched between longer gaps. "Lost time," he wrote once. "I walked east to gather firewood and came back to the sun already setting. I remember walking. I don't remember hours." Further in, the tone turned desperate. He tried to leave, tried to hike back to the ranger station. Something turned me around. I walked for hours and ended up at my own front step. The handwriting jerked and fractured. Then came entries that chilled Daniel's blood. "I dream in voices. They're not mine. They know I see them. They want me to write them down. And this, the camera doesn't help anymore. They don't care about being filmed. They want memory. They want to be part of the story." Daniel sat back, heart thudding. He reached for his camera, still dead despite a full charge. He replaced the batteries. Nothing. As if something had drained it beyond repair. He turned to the final section of the journal. There, tucked into the back cover, was a faded photograph. It was black and white, wrinkled and brittle at the edges. In it, Elias Hart stood at the edge of the same clearing Daniel had filmed weeks ago. His face was blurred, but his posture unmistakable rigid, eyes fixed on something behind the camera. And behind him, half hidden among the trees, stood a shape. The same figure Daniel had captured, tall, narrow, unblinking. Always watching. He placed the photograph beside his own footage still paused on the screen. It was the same frame decades apart. The trees had aged. The light had changed. But the figure was unchanged, like it didn't belong to time at all. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Elias hadn't just documented them. He'd interacted with them. And then he'd vanished, leaving behind only pages and a photograph that should never have existed. Daniel thought about Cliff's warning, about how those who looked too long were never the same. He had looked, he had filmed, and now they were closer than ever. He turned back to the journal, scanning the final pages. Elias had written less in his final days, his entries descending into broken sentences and strange symbols, circular marks, inverted trees, open eyes. One sentence was repeated again and again, scribbled in the margins. "She remembers me." No context. No explanation. Just those 3 words. Daniel's mind raced. Who was she? The forest? One of the figures? A lost loved one? He remembered one entry earlier on, where Elias had written about hearing his late wife's voice in the wind. Could these things take on familiar voices? Shapes? Were they not just watchers, but imitators? Daniel rose from the table and walked to the window. The trees stood still in the morning light, calm and almost beautiful. But now he knew better. They weren't just trees anymore. They were a curtain, and something on the other side was peering through. He didn't film that day. He didn't hike or set trail cameras or take notes. He sat quietly in his cabin and read every last word Elias had written, committing it to memory. He understood now why the journal had been buried, why the forest had hidden the path. It wasn't meant to be found. It was a warning. And now Daniel was entangled in the same thread Elias had followed. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the story. By evening, he made a decision. He would return to the ruins once more, not to film, not to disturb, but to return the journal, to set it back where it belonged. He didn't know if it would help. He didn't even know if it would matter, but something in his chest told him it was the right thing to do. The woods had allowed him in. Perhaps if he gave back what he'd taken, they might let him out. That night, just before sleep, he sat by the fire holding the journal close. The whispers returned, not from outside this time, but from within. A rustle of memory, a flicker of someone else's thoughts. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw her. A woman, her face obscured, standing beside Elias. In the same spot in the woods, whispering into his ear. She turned, and for a brief, shattering second, Daniel saw her eyes. Not angry, not afraid, just endless, reflecting trees, sky, and something older than memory. He woke in the dark, the journal still clutched in his arms. And somewhere in the woods, something waited. The forest welcomed him like it had been expecting his return. Daniel stepped beyond the tree line just after sunrise. The air crisp and quiet, every branch painted gold by the morning light. The journal was tucked carefully into his backpack, wrapped in an old scarf to protect it, though something about the book felt impervious to damage, as if age had preserved it with purpose rather than wear. He carried no camera this time, no trail gear or recording equipment. Just the book, a flashlight, and the steady, unspoken weight of his own decision. He had no plan to capture anything. This wasn't for curiosity anymore. It was an offering, a gesture he hoped the forest might understand. He retraced the path slowly, this time without hesitation, following the old stones as they emerged from the moss like forgotten headstones. They hadn't been visible the day before, but now they stood clear, marking the trail as though something had cleared the way for him. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from some invisible presence that wrapped around his shoulders like a cloak. The trees grew denser the deeper he walked, yet he never lost sight of the path. It was there, always, just ahead, revealing itself one curve at a time, as if it had been buried beneath memory and was only now resurfacing through his choice to return by mid-morning. The ruins came into view, still half collapsed, choked in vines and silence. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, the wind low and breathless, the trees circling like sentinels. The structure was no different than before: broken boards, rusted stove, the rocking chair still askew, but it didn't feel abandoned this time. It felt patient, as if the cabin had been waiting for someone to come back. Slowly, reverently, Daniel crossed the clearing, stepped over the threshold, and entered what remained of Elias Hart's final refuge. The light through the open roof cast long, slanted shadows across the dirt floor, and for a moment Daniel just stood there, listening. The air inside the cabin was thick, but not with dust, with memory, as if every corner still held the breath of a man who'd stared too long into the woods and seen something he could never unsee. Daniel knelt at the hearth, cleared a space beneath the ruined stones, and placed the journal there. With care, covering it lightly with earth and dried pine needles. Then he whispered, "I brought it back." His voice didn't echo. It didn't feel heard, but it didn't need to. Something inside him shifted. Not a release, exactly, but a sense that the path ahead now belonged to choice rather than compulsion. He stood and turned toward the door. That's when he heard it. Not a footstep, not wind, a hum. Low and deep, like the sound of distant thunder rumbling just beneath the surface of the earth. It didn't grow louder, but it grew closer, pressing against his skin like a vibration. Daniel moved slowly outside, eyes scanning the trees. The clearing hadn't changed, but the light had. Shadows had stretched unnaturally across the forest floor, twisting beneath the trees as though alive. He took a step back and saw, just at the edge of the woods, the same tall figure, unmoving, watching. This time, he didn't freeze. He didn't raise a camera or try to run. He just stood there, breath steady, gaze locked. The figure remained perfectly still, framed by branches that seemed to bend toward it. Its shape was wrong human, but not. It didn't flicker. It didn't fade. It simply was. Daniel felt his heartbeat slow, not from calm, but from surrender. He realized then that this moment wasn't confrontation. It was communion. Then something extraordinary happened. A second figure stepped out beside the first. Smaller, slighter, And though the face was obscured by light and distance, Daniel felt a sudden, inexplicable pang in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. The second figure raised a hand palm, open, gentle, like a farewell or a greeting, and for a heartbeat that stretched far too long, Daniel thought he heard his name, not in sound, but in memory. It was a woman's voice, soft, familiar, a whisper from a life long past. And then they were gone, not vanished, not erased, but as though they'd never stood there at all. The forest returned to stillness. The wind came back. Birds began to sing overhead. And Daniel stood alone, the shadows melting back into the shape of the trees. He walked home without looking back. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun had drifted low behind the hills. He lit a fire, not for warmth, but for light, and sat in the same old chair where this journey had begun. His camera remained untouched. The motion sensors, the monitors, the footage, all forgotten. None of it mattered anymore. He understood. Now that some stories were not meant to be recorded, only remembered. That night, for the first time in weeks, the forest didn't whisper. No thuds, no shadows, no voices at the edge of sleep. Just the sound of wind in the pines and the gentle crackle of the fire. Daniel leaned back, eyes closing, a single thought drifting through his mind. The forest hadn't taken Elias. It had kept him, like a secret, like a song only the trees still knew how to sing. And maybe now it had taken Daniel too, not in body, but in spirit. Because once you've truly seen the forest's face, it never truly lets you go. The days that followed his return from the ruined cabin passed in a strange calm. Daniel no longer heard the whispers at night, and the forest, once pulsing with presence, had gone still again. Not dead, but quiet, like something that had fed its fill and retreated into the deeper roots of the land. He should have felt relief. He should have felt peace. Instead, he felt empty, as if some part of him had been gently scooped out and carried into the woods where it would remain, nameless and unseen. And yet, as his routine returned to something resembling normal, he began to feel an itch he couldn't ignore, an echo of curiosity, soft but persistent, tugging at the edges of his thoughts like a child with a question no one wants to answer. On the third day, Daniel sat at his desk and opened his laptop again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before he finally clicked through the files. He hadn't touched any of the trail camera footage since the night he found the journal. Hadn't wanted to look at the figures again. Hadn't wanted to invite their gaze back. But now, drawn not by obsession but by the need to understand, he opened the folder labeled simply, Field a Night Feed. The screen blinked, then rows of thumbnails appeared. Clips spanning the last several weeks, each marked by motion triggers. He scrolled slowly, stopping at one he hadn't reviewed yet timestamped 3 nights before his first encounter. He opened the video and watched. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The forest was dark, trees swaying gently, the light from the camera faint but steady, then a flicker. Frame 147. Just like before, the glitch. Only this time, something was different. Instead of a shadow figure, there was a shape round, luminous, hovering between 2 trees. He paused the frame and leaned closer. It wasn't a figure. It was a symbol. Circular, with 3 lines intersecting at odd angles. He didn't recognize it, but something about it scratched at his memory. He fast-forwarded to the next clip. Another glitch. Another moment of distortion. And there it was again, different position, same shape. A symbol, appearing only in the exact instant the interference happened. Heart racing, Daniel began reviewing the footage in reverse order. Every anomaly had one of these symbols buried within the static, each variation slightly different, as if evolving or communicating. Some were clearer than others, drawn in faint lines of light that faded too quickly to study. Others were sharp, almost seared into the digital grain of the image. He began taking screenshots, isolating them one by one. When he laid them side by side, something incredible happened. They formed a pattern dot. It wasn't random. The symbols, when arranged in sequence, created a kind of map, not a geographic one, but something more abstract. A message, maybe. A cycle. He saw repetition in the arcs, mirrored shapes across different nights. The forest wasn't just reacting to being watched. It was responding. It was using the only language left to reach someone who had truly seen it. Daniel stared at the sequence for hours, mapping the progression of symbols across the nights. The pattern built toward a center, as if converging on something. A date? A place? A moment? He opened the footage from the very first night, the one with the blurry figure at the edge of the clearing, and froze. There, tucked just behind the static, hidden in the shadows like a watermark, was the clearest symbol yet. It wasn't glowing like the others, but etched in negative space. And he'd seen it before. Not on the footage. In Elias's journal, one of the drawings scratched into the margin during those last frantic entries. A circle split by two vertical lines, one of them jagged, as though struck by lightning. Daniel dug through his memory. That symbol had been next to the sentence. They want to be remembered in return. Suddenly, something clicked. This wasn't interference. This was intention. The forest, or whatever dwelled beneath its skin, was speaking not in words, but in signs, through the very medium Daniel had used to observe it. They weren't afraid of being watched. They were waiting for someone who could see. That night, Daniel set up the monitor again, not to record, just to observe. He connected his external screen, cleared the desk, and sat in the dark with nothing but the hum of the laptop and the low crackle of the fire behind him. Hours passed. Midnight. 1, then 2. The footage played in silence. No movement. No interference. Then, frame 263. A flash. This time, no figure. Just light. Pure, concentrated light that pulsed like a heartbeat, then vanished. He paused a frame. On the tree, where no carving had ever been, was the symbol, the one from the journal. Only now, it wasn't faint or hidden. It was burned into the bark, as if something had reached out through the lens and marked the real world. Daniel stood, heart pounding, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The forest was silent, still. The moon hung heavy overhead, casting long silver shadows through the trees. He walked to the clearing, eyes scanning every surface. At first, he saw nothing. Then, on the trunk of the old birch closest to the trail, his breath caught in his throat. There it was, the mark, etched deep into the bark, too precise to be natural, too fresh to be old. The same shape from the footage, the same symbol from Elias's pages. He touched it, fingertips tracing the grooves. The bark felt warm, not like heat, but like something had passed through it recently, like memory embedded in wood. And for the first time, Daniel understood something he hadn't before. The forest wasn't trying to frighten him. It was trying to connect, not with everyone, just with the ones who chose to look past the fear, the ones who listened, the ones who remembered Dot as the wind stirred gently through the leaves and the mark pulsed faintly in the moonlight. Daniel whispered aloud, "I see you." And somewhere deep in the trees, something unseen stirred. It began again on a Wednesday evening, just after sunset, when the light over the trees faded into that thin gray between day and night, the hour when the forest feels like it's holding its breath. Daniel had been sitting by the fire, staring at the monitor, eyes glazed from too many nights of watching static flicker and shadows rearrange themselves. The symbol on the birch tree had stayed visible for 3 days, growing darker as if the bark itself wanted it preserved. It hadn't changed. It hadn't faded. And yet Daniel sensed it wasn't finished. It was like a word half-spoken, a sentence waiting for its last breath. That night, the wind came back, not a storm, not sharp, but restless, whining between trees like it had somewhere to be. Daniel watched the footage from the live trail feed. In silence, waiting for the flicker, the glitch, the familiar static that now felt less like a warning and more like a door opening. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Then, at 2:17 a.m., he saw the light again. Not a flash, but a pulse brief and rhythmic, like the flicker of a heartbeat across the lens. He leaned in, breath caught, as the trees in the frame began to shift, almost imperceptibly, bending inward toward the center of the clearing. The wind outside his cabin picked up at the same time, swirling against the windows as if trying to reach through the glass. Then, just beyond the trail, the figure stepped into view. This time, there was no glitch, no static, no blur. The image was clear, crisp. The tall silhouette stood directly beneath the trees, its form impossibly still, its presence undeniable. The shape was human, but elongated, its limbs too long, its head too still. It didn't move. It didn't approach. It simply appeared, as if it had always been there, and Daniel was only now seeing it clearly for the first time. His breath slowed. He reached instinctively for the camera, then stopped. Not out of fear, but reverence. The figure was looking directly at the lens, though it had no visible eyes. Daniel could feel it, an awareness passing through the feed, through the screen, directly into the room. And then it raised its hand. The motion was deliberate, slow, a gesture not of threat, but of invitation. Daniel stood, heart pounding, not with panic, but with a strange certainty. He slipped on his coat, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The air had grown colder, though the sky remained clear. The moon hung high and full, casting long shadows over the frost-laced ground. He walked the path in silence, every step measured, each breath visible in the chill. He didn't bring a camera. He didn't need proof anymore. This was beyond proof. This was presence. As he approached the clearing, the wind stopped. The trees stood frozen. And there, exactly where the monitor had shown it, stood the figure waiting. Daniel stepped into the open space, his boots crunching softly beneath him, his flashlight pointed low to avoid breaking the moment. The figure didn't move. It remained still, framed by trees that now seemed taller, darker, older. Daniel stopped a dozen feet away. He wanted to speak, but found no words. Instead, he waited. Then the figure stepped back. It didn't retreat in fear. It withdrew with purpose, turning slowly and moving deeper into the woods, along a path Daniel hadn't seen before, narrow, overgrown, yet unmistakably a trail. He hesitated, then followed. The path wound through trees that leaned in like guardians, their branches brushing his shoulders as he passed. The figure moved ahead, always just in view, its movement smooth, almost gliding, always silent. They walked for what felt like hours, though Daniel knew it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Then the trees parted. They arrived at a place that didn't exist on any map, that no trail had ever marked. A clearing perfectly circular, surrounded by stones carved with the same symbols he'd seen in the footage. At the center stood a structure, not a cabin, not a ruin, but something ancient and impossible to date. It resembled an altar, or perhaps a gateway, built from stone worn smooth by time, vines curling around its base like fingers reclaiming it. The figure stopped before it, turned, and for the first time, Daniel saw its face. It wasn't a face. In the human sense, it held no eyes, no mouth, no expression. But it radiated something Daniel couldn't define: recognition, grief, memory. He felt himself trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation that something sacred was happening, something older than names, older than the language they were no longer speaking. The figure stepped aside. Daniel approached the structure, placing a hand on the stone. It felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. Then he understood. This wasn't a destination. It was a choice. A place where the veil between things grew thin, where those who listened could see beyond what others dismissed. Elias had reached this place. And now, Daniel had the figure slowly vanished, not disappearing in a flash, but folding into the air like smoke, leaving no trace. Daniel stood alone in the clearing, breath shallow, heart steady. He knew then that whatever came next would not be about discovery. It would be about memory, about holding what he had seen and carrying it without trying to own it. The forest had opened something to him not as a warning, but as a gift. And now, it would be his to protect. Daniel did not speak of what he saw that night. He didn't write it down. He didn't try to film it. It was not meant for explanation. Some truths sit too deep for words, too wide for the lens. When he returned to his cabin just before dawn, the air smelled sweeter than usual, like cedar warmed by light, though the sky was still dark. The stone structure, the figure, the quiet presence in that sacred clearing, they had left no marks behind, not even footprints. And yet something inside him had shifted permanently. He could feel it in the stillness of his breath, in the hush of the forest when he stepped outside, in the strange calm that followed him into every room of his home. The forest was still the same, but Daniel wasn't. The footage from the previous night had not recorded. The monitor had run, the indicator light blinking steadily, but when he checked the files, the window was blank. No data, as if the camera had blinked in unison with his own eyes and decided this moment was not to be stored. At first, he worried the footage had been corrupted, but a deeper part of him already knew the truth. Some things were not meant to be captured. They could only be carried in memory, felt in silence, remembered in the way a scent can return a moment from 30 years ago, or the way a certain stillness can remind you of someone long gone. Daniel spent the next few days walking the woods with nothing but a notebook in his coat pocket, not to write what he saw, but to write how it felt. He wandered without direction, letting the trees decide his course. The forest welcomed him now in a way it never had before. The animals didn't scatter at his presence. The wind didn't fight against his path. He no longer had to find the path, it found him. He saw things that would have once startled him, but now felt like part of the rhythm. A deer standing absolutely still, staring into the trees as if listening for something. A strange flower blooming in frost-covered soil. A ring of mushrooms growing in the exact shape of one of the forest symbols. He stopped trying to make sense of it. Instead, he began to see the change was subtle, like a curtain slowly lifting. He realized that the forest he had known all his life had always been layered. One version for the world, and one hidden underneath. Now he could feel both. There were moments when he sensed something watching, not with threat, but with interest, as if the forest itself had grown curious about him in return. He began to hear soft sounds when there was no wind tones too musical to be coincidence, too rhythmic to be random. A low hum here, a distant chime there. Not often, just enough to make him stop and listen. And then there were the lights. He first noticed them while walking along the northern ridge trail at dusk, just as the sun slipped behind the hills. Tiny pulses of amber and pale green, flickering among the trunks like fireflies, only they didn't move like insects. They hovered with intention, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in spirals, then vanished before he could draw closer. He never followed them. Something inside told him they weren't leading. They were watching. A week passed like this, each day bringing with it something new, something unseen finally coming into view. Daniel never once left the forest during that time. He didn't answer his phone, didn't return messages. Cliff stopped by the cabin once, but left after finding the door locked and smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. Daniel knew he'd worry, but he also knew there was no way to explain this without sounding mad. The forest had opened something ancient, and now Daniel lived inside it, part of a story written long before he'd arrived. One morning, he found an arrangement of twigs on his porch, set in the shape of the symbol that had first appeared in his footage, the broken circle split by lightning. It hadn't been placed by hand. It had grown that way, as if the forest was beginning to speak back. The most haunting part, however, wasn't the sights or the sounds. It was the dreams. They came softly, like whispered invitations, guiding him to places he'd never walked and showing him people he'd never met. And yet, when he woke, they felt like memories. He dreamed of Elias standing at the edge of a pool of still water, staring down at his own reflection. He dreamed of a woman with no face, standing beside a burning tree, her voice humming the same rhythm Daniel had begun to hear while walking alone. Sometimes, the dreams were just images, stone circles buried beneath moss, paths leading into fog, eyes carved into bark, blinking slowly. One night, he dreamed of the structure again, the ancient stone formation in the hidden clearing, but this time, he was inside it. The symbols around him weren't just marks. They moved, rearranged themselves like puzzle pieces trying to explain a truth too large for a single page. He reached out to touch one, and it flared with light. He awoke in the dark, heart racing, and found a faint line of ash on his fingertips, as if he had truly touched something burning. That morning, Daniel sat at the edge of the porch, watching the fog lift from the forest floor. Something was coming. He could feel it now, like the slow turn of a tide, like a deep breath held just before the plunge. The forest had more to say, and this time, he knew it wouldn't be through images or whispers or shadows. It would come as something complete, something final, and he would be ready to receive it. It was just before dawn when Daniel first noticed the trees had changed. He wasn't sure how long they had been that way, or if they had always been like that and he had only now learned how to see it. But there was no denying it. Something had shifted, not in the trees themselves, but in the space between them, as though the forest had rearranged its own language. The branches bent in unfamiliar ways, and certain trunks leaned ever so slightly toward each other, forming deliberate gaps, arches, and lines. At first glance, it might have seemed like wind damage or growth patterns, but Daniel knew better. This was structure, intention, and when he stepped back and looked again, he saw it clearly: symbols, not carved or drawn, but formed by the living forest itself. 3 trees leaning in at precise angles created a broken triangle, matching one of the older symbols from Elias's journal. Another section formed a series of X shapes when viewed from the right distance, their symmetry too perfect to be accidental. He wandered deeper, eyes tracing these living arrangements, and the more he saw, the more certain he became. The forest had become a script. It wasn't speaking in words. It was writing in light and shadow, bark and branch. Daniel began sketching the shapes in his notebook, mapping them as he walked, building a silent lexicon he didn't fully understand, but instinctively recognized. Every morning brought new alignments: trees that had subtly shifted, moss that had grown in straight lines along the ground, roots that curled into circular spirals overnight. The forest was alive in a way beyond biology. It wasn't just reacting. It was communicating, and it was telling him something. The dreams intensified. They no longer drifted in softly. They pulled him under like currents. He stopped fighting them. One night, he dreamed of a grove he had never seen, lit by a golden glow that came from nowhere. In the center stood the figure, not watching, not waiting, but weeping. And Daniel, in the dream, reached out not to study or question, but to comfort. When he woke, he found a single feather on his pillow. Pale gray, impossibly soft, still warm. He didn't keep it. He placed it in the notch of a tree outside the cabin, not as an offering, but as an acknowledgement. One afternoon, as the light slanted low and the forest held that golden silence of early evening, Daniel returned to the site where he had first filmed the strange movement in the trees. The clearing looked unchanged, but the air felt heavy with purpose. He stepped carefully around the space, and then he saw it etched into the earth, as if by hundreds of careful hands, was a vast symbol formed entirely by fallen needles, leaves, and branches. A circle split by a single crooked line, ringed, with triangles and nested arcs. It was enormous, at least 20 feet wide, and every piece looked placed with impossible precision. He stepped to the center and closed his eyes. The forest fell into utter stillness. Then, faintly, he heard them, not voices exactly, but impressions. Words carried on the hush of trees swaying, on the slow creak of branches leaning. He didn't understand the language, not in a literal sense, but something deeper moved through him. A message without grammar, a memory from something older than thought. He stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, breathing slowly, letting the present surround him. And then, just as quietly as it had arrived, it withdrew. Daniel opened his eyes, and standing on the far edge of the clearing was the figure. Not the tall, faceless watcher this time, but a woman, human, barefoot, pale dress brushing the forest floor. Her hair long and dark, her features blurred by distance and soft light, but her stillness unmistakable. She didn't move. She simply stood there, holding something in her hands, a book. The journal. Elias's journal. Daniel's breath caught. He had buried it. He had returned it. But here it was, no longer worn and faded, but restored. Whole. She looked down at it, then back at him. Her gaze held no fear, no warning, only clarity. She stepped forward and placed the journal on the ground at the edge of the symbol. Then, she vanished, not like smoke this time, but like morning mist burned off by light. Daniel approached slowly, knelt, and picked up the book. It felt warm in his hands, alive somehow. He opened the first page, and there, beneath Elias's name, was a new line written in careful, unfamiliar script. The story continues with you. The rest of the journal was blank. He carried it home in silence. That night, he lit a fire and stared at the blank pages, feeling the weight of them, the invitation they held. The forest had given him back the book, not as an artifact, but as a responsibility. It was no longer about documentation. It was about continuation, about bearing witness, about remembering, not for himself, but for whatever came after. And as the firelight danced on the cabin walls, Daniel understood. The forest did not just want to be seen. It wanted to be remembered. And in the language of branch and wind, of symbol and shadow, it had chosen him to carry its story. The forest held its breath as the season shifted. The last of the autumn leaves clung to the trees in shivering defiance, their gold and crimson edges curling inward, preparing to fall. The air had grown colder, sharper, but Daniel didn't mind. He wore the chill like a second skin now, his every movement attuned to the forest's rhythm. He woke with the sun, walked without direction, and let the silence fill in the spaces where thought once tried to make sense of the unknowable. The journal, newly returned and mysteriously blank save for the line beneath Elias's name, now lay open beside the fire each night. Daniel hadn't written in it, not yet. Something told him to wait. The forest would give the words when it was time. Then one morning, without warning, he knew it had come. It wasn't a voice that spoke. It was more like a certainty rising from the ground beneath him. He stepped out onto the porch and found the world covered in a thin veil of frost, each blade of grass etched with delicate ice. The trees were silent, but not still. They seemed to lean in, anticipating. That morning, he didn't bring his coat. He didn't need light. He carried only the journal in his hand and walked. He didn't take a path. He walked through the heart of the forest like he had been summoned. Trees parted just enough for him to pass, and the air pulsed with that familiar low, not mechanical, not musical, but alive. By the time he reached the clearing where he'd first seen the stone structure, the light had changed. It wasn't quite dawn anymore, and it wasn't exactly day. The world shimmered in between, as though reality had been ever so slightly to allow something else to emerge. The structure stood waiting, not ancient now, but whole. The vines had withdrawn. The stones gleamed faintly with some internal glow. And behind it, standing tall and unmoving, were three figures. Not blurred, not distant. They were clear, pale faces, eyes like deep pools reflecting stars. One held the shape of the woman who had returned the journal. Another, taller, bore the posture of the first figure Daniel had ever seen. The third was smaller, almost childlike, but cloaked in the same stillness. Daniel stepped forward, not afraid, not even in awe. Just ready. The tallest of them extended a hand. Not demanding, not beckoning offering. Daniel approached, placed the journal in that outstretched hand, and as his fingers released the leather cover, something opened. Not in the sky, not on the ground, but inside him. Memory, sound, light, a vision not seen with eyes, but with something. Deeper, he saw Elias Younger standing where he now stood. He saw the moment the forest had first shown him its secret, a symbol burned into his sight, the understanding that changed him. He saw the years of solitude that followed, the heartbreak of trying to tell a truth no one would believe, the final days spent etching desperate thoughts into that journal. And then he saw something even older, a time before names, before language, when people and forest were one story, a shared breath, a shared knowing. He saw a time when humans listened, when they understood the forest was not a place but a presence, a living memory that required care, reverence, and return. And he saw when it broke, when people forgot, when cameras replaced eyes and maps replaced instinct, when the old stories were buried beneath asphalt and the voices of the trees went unheard. But the forest had not forgotten that it had waited, watched, reached out, in dreams, in shapes, in echoes across grainy footage and pages worn thin with time. And it had chosen him not because he was special, but because he was willing to remember. The vision faded slowly, like a tide receding from shore. Daniel blinked and the figures were gone. So was the structure. The clearing had returned to its quiet, unassuming form. But the journal was back in his hands, only now its pages were full. Not in Elias's hand, in his dozens of entries, written in the exact words he would have used had he tried. Dates, descriptions, feelings he hadn't yet dared to put down. They had been written not by his pen, but by his witness. The forest had remembered through him. He walked home in silence, holding the journal like a sacred object. That night, he sat by the fire and read the entries slowly, one by one. Each page pulsed with something more than ink. They breathed, they shimmered. They told the truth not of what the forest was, but of what it had been and what it could still become if someone kept the memory alive. The next morning, Daniel packed a small bag, left the cabin key on the table, and locked the door behind him. He walked to town, something he hadn't done in weeks. When he arrived at the local historical society office, he asked to speak with the curator. He placed the journal on the desk, smiled gently, and said, "I think this belongs here." The curator opened it, eyes widening, then looked up to ask a question, but Daniel was already gone, slipping quietly out the door like a man returning to the woods from which he had never really emerged. He didn't disappear. Not entirely. Locals, said. He moved deeper into the forest, built a smaller cabin farther up the ridge, lived with no electricity, no phone. But every now and then someone would find a bundle left on their doorstep, a drawing of a tree in perfect detail, a page of writing with no name, a symbol traced in charcoal that stirred something in the oldest corners of their mind. And though no one ever saw him again, the forest felt different. Not louder, not wilder, just more present, as if it had found its voice again. And somewhere, in the hush between wind and branch, in the pause between bird call and breeze, it whispered, "Ah, name not to be summoned, but to be remembered." And so, the forest keeps its silence, but maybe, just maybe, it's listening for someone like you to remember. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for walking through the mystery, the wonder, and the whispers hidden deep in the trees. Stories like this remind us that there's still magic in the world if we take the time to look and to listen. If this story moved you, stirred something in your heart, or reminded you of a moment you've never forgotten, I'd love to hear from you. Please take a second to like this video. It truly helps more people find it. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story we share. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your feelings, or even your own mysterious encounter with nature. I read every one, and your words mean more than you know. Until next time, stay curious and keep listening.